All right, class, welcome to chapter 13, the letter to the Ephesians. Now, one of the items you're going to find in most of your more scholarly commentaries is going to be the discussion about Pauline authorship. Now, the letter claims to be authored by Paul in the opening, the body of the letter. The letter was in wide circulation early, and its authenticity was not in doubt in the early church. There are many Pauline features we see in this letter, and similarities with Colossians suggest that Paul wrote Ephesians and Colossians, and of course Ephesians, one of the prison epistles, meaning he was in prison when he authored this. So its similarity to Colossians shows similar authorship, I think, and many truly hold that this is a Pauline letter. Paul is not mentioned in Revelation, even though Ephesus, the church in Ephesus, was addressed by John, and yet he doesn't mention Paul. There doesn't seem to be much of a reason why an author would use Paul's name pseudonymously if he's writing to Ephesus. In other words, if John didn't mention him in later years, there probably wouldn't be a lot of fanfare for someone who's wanting to write a pseudonymous letter to take his name, right? Put it on there. In other words, if he didn't have rock star status to be mentioned in Revelation, why would somebody try to copy him? You see that argument? Okay. There are themes in Ephesians that have closest parallels in the undisputed Pauline letters. In other words, like Romans, Galatians, the undisputed Paulines have similar themes. The letter fits the context of Paul being in prison. That matches. It shows development from earlier letters, which would have been natural. As he's getting toward the end of his life, he's now imprisoned, and we see development that's often been one of the criticisms of Pauline authorship. But hey, you would expect that from a guy who's been through all the trials he was through, and his faith and character are developing. Another point is they say, well, Paul used the term ecclesia, the word for church, in reference to only individual congregations, while here in Ephesians, it's speaking of a universal church. Okay, so in other words, let me sort of translate that. He uses the word ecclesia for the church, and he used it in these letters where he specifically wrote to one church. Well, it would also make sense, on a contra view, if the letter was intended to be widely circulated. Okay? So, in other words, we've discovered in recent years that there are personal letters, or there were personal letters, like the book of Philemon. It was shorter and intended to be read by a person, okay, by Philemon. And then there were these tractates, or these letters that were longer, that were designed and written with characteristics of ancient Greco-Roman letter writing that were intended to be read in a public forum, or to be read widely by more than just one church. So, what Carson and Moo are saying is that this makes sense that he would use ecclesia if it was intended to be widely circulated and read. Pretty good argument. The anti-Pauline authorship people say there's no emphasis on the parousia. The parousia is Christ's second coming. Well, this would assume a strange view of 1:14, 4:30, 5:6, 6:8. In other words, when he talks about the heavenlies, it would be odd to try to translate that into the parousia. So, if you read in Ephesians, if you're going to read into it that is the parousia, well, I'll just read it here for you. In Ephesians 1:14, we read, go back to 13. In him who you trusted after you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, in whom having believed you were sealed with the Holy Spirit promise, who, that is Christ, is the guarantee of our inheritance until the redemption of the possession, to the praise of his glory. In other words, what they're saying is that there's no emphasis on the parousia. But when you read that 1:14, that sounds exactly like the parousia that's coming in the future, right? Yes. 4:30. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you are sealed for the day of redemption. That sounds to me like day of redemption is future. So he's talking about the coming parousia. So you see how they would argue that you have no emphasis on, or rather that they believed in realized eschatology, they're trying to make those statements seem like he's already come back. Okay, so you can see in 5:6 and 6:8 similar argument there. So the portrayal of Paul as commissioned to bring about the unity between Jew and Gentile, even though he's an apostle to the Gentiles. So this argument is, if Paul was supposed to go to the Gentiles and Peter to the Jews, why is he so concerned about unity in this letter? Therefore, it has to have been written by somebody else besides Paul. Well, Paul is concerned about unity in almost all of his letters, Romans and Galatians, so shoots that one down. Another argument, Ephesians contains language not elsewhere found in Paul's writings. But Carson and Moo retort that the use of hapax legomena is actually at a lower rate in Ephesians than it is in 2 Corinthians or Philippians. Hapax legomenon is what that means is it's the one-time use of a word. That's a hapax. I'm sorry, class, my phone is somebody's burning it up here. Let's see. I'll talk to them later. So the hapax legomena is a word that's used once. So there's actually less of these in this letter than in other non-disputed Pauline letters. So you can't use that argument, okay, that somebody else had to write it because, because there's these hapax in there. They argue the writing style is more pleonastic, that is cliched or repetitive. So in other words, it doesn't sound like Paul, according to the opponents. But Carson Moose say this is present but highly exaggerated. It's not present to the degree that some of the anti-Pauline authorship people would suppose, and Paul uses this type of language in other places. And their last argument, it seems to be an example of an early big C, big Catholic writing. So if you're going to make it really late, you would say it's a Catholic document. There are no distinct indications that the apostles are off the scene. Okay, so another argument, they say in Colossians, some would say the same writer couldn't have produced both of these letters due to their similarities. Some doubt that Ephesians because it's too different from Colossians. But the prominence is likely from Rome, but there could be other possibilities. Likely, we're talking about a date in the early 60s. And if you put it in Rome, so if Paul isn't the author, then they date it like in the 90s, okay? I'd go with the 60s. To the Ephesians, in Ephesus, is not in some of the better manuscripts. Now, this is what we call a textual variant. So it's a textual variant that comes in later. And because of that textual variant, Marcion the heretic, thought it was a letter to the Laodiceans. Basil said that the letter circulated in his day to the saints who are faithful. Okay, he mentions that in his letter. So the phrase to the Ephesians this textual variant could mean that it was originally intended to be a circular letter, so they didn't put Ephesus in there. And this is perhaps the best form of the theory, holds that Paul sent the letter with Tychicus when he sent Colossians, and the letter was copied and then circulated from Ephesus with a blank instead of the name of the recipients, but was always associated with Ephesus. So we do not know for certain to whom the letter was originally addressed, but most evidence points to the church at Ephesus, though it was probably meant to be a circular letter. Okay? So in other words, they're saying the original probably did not. We have these early manuscripts don't show the name for the destination. So if it was read as a circular letter around to all the churches, but yet it's associated, if it came to Ephesus, it was associated with Ephesus, so a scribe later then puts that in there. Okay, so that would account for the addition in later manuscripts and for the omission in the early manuscripts. So it doesn't really negate Pauline authorship. It just says hey, it was probably a circular letter, and Paul sent it to be read to all the churches there in that vicinity. Okay, the purpose. There is tension between Jew and Gentile Christians. Instruction on Gentile converts that were new in the faith. There is unity in a distinctively Christian ethic, and there is reconciliation in Christ. Those are great purposes for this letter. And finally, last slide, the contribution of Ephesians. There's stress on Christ's saving work. We see the importance of the Christian's growth in knowledge of God and of the gospel, an emphasis on being rooted and established in love, quote unquote. We see ecclesiology here. We see living in conformity with the salvation that God has given believers and the supreme place of God who brings salvation to undeserving sinners. This is a great letter. I know you'll enjoy reading it.